Before a convicted felon is executed by lethal injection or in the electric chair, it is usually customary for the criminal to have one last opportunity to address the public with final words. Sometimes inmates take this opportunity to make peace with their actions, while others say a chilling statement that is aimed to shock or upset people. There have been a ton of chilling last words from inmates right before they take their last breaths. So here's the top 10 evil last words from those prisoners. Number 10. Robert Alton Harris. Starting things off, and at number 10, we have Robert Alton Harris. He said, "You can be a king or a street sweeper, but everyone dances with the Grim Reaper." He was arrested on July 5th, 1978, when him and his brother hijacked a car with 2 teenage boys in it. They ordered them to drive to a remote location where the brothers brutally murdered them, and then used the vehicle as a getaway car when they robbed the San Diego bank. Robert Harris was arrested just 1 hour after the robbery, and he was charged with murder, auto theft, kidnapping, burglary, and bank robbery. One of the arresting officers was the father of one of the murdered boys, but he didn't realize that the victim was his son until later. He wasn't even able to recognize his son's face. That's how violent the murder was. Robert Harris was sentenced to death in 1979, but after many appeals, he was finally executed in San Quentin's gas chamber on April 21st, 1992. Number 9. George Engel. Moving up this list with George Engel in at number 9. He was an anarchist who didn't like to follow any sort of rules or regulations. He was involved with a lot of activisms and protests in the Chicago area. A protest bombing took place in Haymarket Square in Chicago that resulted in the deaths of 7 police officers, 4 civilians, and a lot of other people were seriously injured. George Engel was actually at home playing cards while this riot broke out, but he was arrested the next day and charged with conspiracy in the bombings. He was convicted and sentenced to hanging. But before he took his last breath, he said, "Hurrah for anarchy. This is the happiest moment of my life." Number 8. Robert Keith Coleman. Roger Keith Coleman makes his last statement in at number 8. His case gained nationwide attention and major controversy because he maintained his innocence the whole time during his conviction, and even right before he was executed. During his final words, he said, "An innocent man is going to be murdered tonight. When my innocence is proven, I hope Americans will realize the injustice of the death penalty, as all other civilized countries have." He was convicted in Virginia for assaulting and murdering his sister-in-law on the day that he had been laid off from work. After his death, the DNA evidence was reanalyzed, and in January 2006, the governor announced that the testing of the DNA evidence had conclusively proven that he was guilty of the crime. Okay, that's great and all, but don't you think you should have done 1,000 tests on that DNA before you executed him? It makes no sense. What if the DNA evidence proved that he wasn't guilty? What would that press conference look like? Oops, we made a massive mistake and killed an innocent man. My bad. Number 7, Timothy McVeigh. And now in at number 7, we have Timothy McVeigh. He infamously said, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." If you guys remember, he was the one who was behind the Oklahoma City bombing, which killed 168 people and injured over 680 others. This bombing is actually the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in the United States. His execution date was set for June 11th, 2001, and he made a request to have it publicly televised, but this motion was denied. He invited a composer to perform classical music on the night of his execution, and he requested to have a Catholic chaplain. He also requested 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream as his last meal. He was executed by lethal injection, and his wait to be executed was way shorter than most inmates waiting on death row. He only spent about 4 years on death row, while most inmates spent an average of 15 years there. Number 6. Jeffrey Dahmer. The infamous Jeffrey Dahmer is in at number 6. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms for murdering 17 men and boys in the Milwaukee area between 1978 to 1991. He was also heavily into necrophiliac, and he kept his victims' body parts in his freezer so that he could eat it later. The interesting part of this story is that Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't given the death penalty. His inmate actually beat him to death because he said that Jeffrey Dahmer was a sick and creepy man. He used to make his prison food look like human body parts, and he would cover them in ketchup to resemble blood. So according to Jeffrey Dahmer's murderer, his last words were, "I don't care if I live or die, go ahead and kill me." Number 5, Tom Blackjack Ketchum. And now in at number 5, we have Tom B. Blackjack Ketchum. He was an outlawed cowboy who murdered someone in 1895. After that, his gang fled to New Mexico where they committed more robberies before he was captured during an unsuccessful attempt to rob a train. He was quickly arrested, put on trial, found guilty, and sentenced to death by hanging. When his execution date arrived, it was the biggest public display in the area because he was the first person to be hanged for a train robbery in New Mexico. However, things didn't go as smoothly as they hoped. Before he was hanged, he said this, "I'll be in hell before you start breakfast, boys. Let her rip." And right after he said that, the rope completely decapitated him, and it is said that his headless body landed on its feet and stayed standing upright for quite some time. Number 4, John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy had 3 famous last words, and this comes in at number 4. He kept it short and sweet when he said, "Kiss my ass." I don't know about you guys, but I think I would have a lot more to say for my final words. But then again, he was a textbook serial killer who didn't really have any emotions. He was known as the Killer Clown because he used to dress up as Pogo the Clown and perform at many charitable events and birthday parties. He took the lives of at least 33 young boys in Illinois, and he would bury their bodies underneath his home. So, when he was convicted of sexual assault in 1968, the police were able to find all of the dead bodies that he tried to cover up. Despite a bunch of corpses being found underneath his own home, he maintained his innocence, but he was found guilty in 1980 because there was so much evidence against him. He was given multiple death penalties and life sentences, and finally, after being on death row for 14 years, he was executed by lethal injection. Number 3, Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos is up next and at number 3. Aileen had a terrible childhood that was full of abuse and abandonment, so it's almost no surprise that she went on a killing rampage that would define her as America's most infamous female serial killer. She worked as a prostitute and she had killed 7 men that picked her up along the highway. Aileen said that all of her murders were out of self-defense, but she was convicted and sentenced to death for 6 of the murders. She was executed by lethal injection on October 9th, 2002. But before she died, she said this, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th. Like the movie, big mothership and all, I'll be back. I don't even know what this means, but I'm scared." Number 2, Carl Panzram. Carl Panzram's last words make it onto this list and at number 2. You probably don't recognize his name, but he is actually known as one of the most sadistic American serial killers. He had more than a dozen aliases, and no one knew anything about what he had done for years until he was captured in November 1928. Before his death, he confessed to killing 21 people and sexually harming 1,000 males. And right before he was hanged, he said, "In my lifetime, I have murdered 21 human beings. One have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons, and last but not least, I have committed sodomy on more than 1,000 male human beings. For all these things, I am not in the least bit sorry." And finally, for the number 1. Number 1, the Vampire of Dusseldorf. He is known as a vampire because he would occasionally attempt to drink the blood from his victims' wounds while they were still alive. But eventually, he was arrested and sentenced to death by beheading because he committed a series of murders and sexual assaults. He even admitted to killing a 9-year-old girl. It is confirmed that he murdered at least 9 people, but the police suspect that he was brutally murdered a lot more people. So, the evening before his death, he ordered a Wiener Schnitzel, a bottle of white wine and fried potatoes, and the next morning he was taken to the guillotine to have his head chopped off. But before he left this world, he made one last scary statement that probably haunted the people who were at his execution. He said, "Tell me, after my head has been chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be a pleasure to end all pleasures." Oh, and if that wasn't enough, his mummified head is on display in a Wisconsin museum after doctors tried to cut it open to find a reason behind his evil. Is this real life right now? Well, there you guys have it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next videos.